Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to The True Connoisseur, my channel where I discuss fragrance as personal experience as cultural object. And today we are taking a look at fragrances from my collection to explore the topic of amber and ambergris. This is a somewhat confusing area in fragrance because advertising mixes these up all the time. When is a fragrance an amber fragrance? When is a fragrance an ambergris fragrance? Is amber just a genre of fragrances? In many ways, the term amber has become chronically overused in the fragrance world, especially now that the term amber is being used to describe anything that is somewhat vanillic, spicy, floral, opulent, as it has become now that it is starting to refer more and more to a genre. I find that I don't like to call amber a genre, properly speaking. Amber, for me, needs to refer to something a little bit more specific, or else you just end up with a category of scents that are not necessarily that related to one another. So, amber can mean one of two things if we give them more specific definitions. The first is more rare in perfume, but it does exist, which is an actual extract from amber resin. Amber, the material, the beautiful fossilized sap creation. That resin can produce an extract that has a smell. There is a fragrance I have that is one of my deepest favorites, which is Clandestine Laboratories Silver. Clandestine Laboratories Silver uses resin extract as the basis of its the basis of its composition. It's a very interesting, unusual aroma as captured in this scent. There are other fragrances that have done this, but it's a very rare thing to actually encounter a fragrance that has used that sort of fossilized sap amber resinoid to, produce a scent. This smells very mineral. It makes me think of stone and moss growing on stone, the way that this composition has filled out those notes. It's gorgeous stuff, but this is actually the rarer form of amber. So when you see amber referred to in fragrance, this is generally not what's being described. It is, however, a lovely, lovely aroma. What is more commonly being referred to is amber as an accord, a fantasy note. It's something that doesn't exist quite properly in nature, but is a commonly reused perfume structure. And that is generally composed of vanilla resins and musk, typically labdanum. If some of you have heard of the fougere genre, the backbone of the fougere is lavender. The backbone of amber is labdanum. Labdanum we'll talk about more here as we go through the fragrances that I have here, but labdanum comes from rock rose. It has a gorgeously dusty, leathery, sometimes cola-like facet. It's a gorgeous material that I've really fallen in love with over the years. And then when you kind of build it out a little bit with musk and vanilla, which are very common pairings, you get a more traditional amber accord. That is typically what is used in perfume to refer to amber. It doesn't always draw upon those exact materials, especially in modern circumstances where it's pulling on synthetic aroma chemicals to create some of those ambery effects. But that accord is the bedrock of it. And I would say most of the times when you're picking up an amber soliflor, which is to say a fragrance that is really built around amber as a single experience, you're getting a lot of labdanum, and in modern fragrances, you're getting a lot of vanilla alongside it, usually, to make it more sweeter and more gourmand in line with modern tastes. And we have some examples of that. But amber is sometimes also used to refer to ambergris. And this is a little bit of confusing. This happens in a lot of European perfumery. In Italy, they often just call ambergris ambra. So there's a bit of confusion there, and some of the complications there is that a perfume can have both an amber accord and ambergris in it together, complementing each other. And if that's the case, what does it mean to have ambergris? So I think ambergris, let's just start with ambergris. Ambergris is a whale byproduct, generally thought to come from cuttlefish, different things like that. But essentially this whale organically produced product, a kind of spit up or something equivalent to that, is expelled by the whale because it couldn't digest a certain element. And it goes through a product of aging on the ocean. It's tossed on the seas and eventually washes up on shore. People use that as a perfume material. Depending on how long that ambergris has been drifting in the ocean, it may be a little bit more skanky, which is it still has some of those organic roots, or it's really dried out and has become much more refined, higher grade ambergris versus lower grade ambergris. Much like oud has higher grade oud and lower grade oud. Whether it's actually higher or lower grade is a matter of subjectivity. Some people will enjoy the more pungent, let's say, dirty facets of ambergris as opposed to the very clean facets of ambergris. I have two fragrances here that certainly use real ambergris, and they are two different fragrances, and then I have a bunch that approach it synthetically from different angles. The first is an attar, Sheikh Faransi by Maison Anthony Marmin. Maison Anthony Marmin is a nice attar house, and this fragrance was introduced to me by Thomas of early Greek fame. It has a lot going on. It's a very French style fragrance in a lot of ways, despite being an attar, with spicy florals, chocolatey patchouli, but it has this huge slug of ambergris that kind of overwhelms it. And ambergris in a naturalistic form like this has a sort of breathy, almost ethereal air. It's very interesting. It's almost aquatic in its oceanic suggestion. Here, it's really giving uplift to a lot of other heavy materials. This is not a light fragrance, but the sort of salty sea spray, air, breathy quality of the ambergris really gives this a lot of volume and space that it ordinarily wouldn't have. I really think Sheikh Faransi is a great place to look if you're looking to get acquainted with ambergris in its pure form without having to spend too pricey a penny. Another fragrance that I don't have is I'm going to butcher the French on this. Les Indemodables Escale en Indonesie. The Indonesia fragrance. It's one of their eau de colognes. It's one of the more affordable fragrances in the Les Indemodables line. It's a great introduction to ambergris. So is their Ambre Supreme, but the Ambre Supreme costs a lot more, and I actually prefer the Escale on Indonesia. But if you're also hungry for another take on ambergris, there is Eris Perfumes Mxxx, which was an Antoine Lee creation. This is very unusual in the sense that it's cacao, vanilla, sandalwood, so it's kind of a gourmandy toned sandalwood, soft, powdery, with that really breathy quality of ambergris. The ambergris is subtle. You really have to know what you're looking for. And it blends nicely with the other facets here. It's kind of in the mix in this, on my skin, I think of this as being very adjacent to a like sandalwood vanilla cacao thing, with dominantly sandalwood, like sandalwood in the beachy sort of sandalwood way that sandalwood can sometimes come off, like a powdery sandalwood, with the very breathy, warm, slightly golden glow of a very refined ambergris. It's beautiful stuff, but I really do recommend this fragrance only to people who are already hungry for ambergris, because the ambergris doesn't come out and grab you by the throat, so to speak. The ambergris is a little bit more subtle. If you're looking for other alternatives in the ambergris space, all four of these are to various degrees synthetic and modern, but they're available, and they kind of capture something of the way ambergris is expressed. The first of these is discontinued, but I'm still seeing it for very affordable prices, so if you can find it, grab it. Gianfranco Ferre Bergamotto Marino, which is an eau de cologne with a big slug of ambergris in the base. It may be real ambergris. We don't know. We're just speculating. But it feels a lot like the ambergris that you are getting in something like Mxxx. That sort of like warm, breathy glow, but here with more of orange blossom and neroli and that sort of family of scents. It's really quite beautiful. It's simple but beautiful, and is a great value if you're getting a bottle like this for under $100, which I'm still seeing. Another one that is great, that does skew in a more synthetic modern direction, is Caron Pornome Sport. There's nothing sporty about this fragrance. It takes the fougere structure of Pornome, makes it very like icy and mentholated slightly. There's a minty quality here. But in the base, you have that same sort of breathy ambergris quality, but it's accentuated by modern synthetic materials, a kind of warm. I would think it's almost like a blend of ambergris and ambroxan. This claims to have some measure of actual ambergris in it, according to the ad copy. I would imagine it's only a minuscule amount. So what is contributing to that ambergris effect must be something synthetic. But it's very lovely. And one fragrance that I think just captures the impression of ambergris in a kind of abstract way, and was intended to do so, is Hermès Eau de Merveilles. A very powdery, beechwoody amber. You're kind of getting the sense here that it's kind of got the same sort of salty, beechwoody quality. It's doing it through other materials. There's no ambergris in this. In fact, this actually starts to bridge into an actual amber, especially if you start to dig into the flankers, which amp up the amber accord in the base and make this into a more amber dominant fragrance. But in this form, it's very focused on ambergris. And then these next three fragrances are kind of a bridging point into talking about amber as an accord, but we'll start here with Ambra, which is a synthetic ambergris rose, with modern dark synthwoods. I really like this a lot. I think the rose note in it is beautiful, and I think the way it handles a synthetic ambergris is actually quite nice. This is a very beautiful, underrated fragrance from Acqua di Parma Ambra. Rose and ambergris works very nicely together. It's a combination that you will also find in in Guerlain's Absolute d'Orient line and things like that. So this fragrance uses that blend to a good effect. So let's talk about a fragrance that bridges the combination of real ambergris and an amber accord as well as it can be done. I've talked about this fragrance before as being one of the greatest things I've ever smelled. Now that I'm even talking about it, I'm probably just going to spray it on as I do this video because it's so good. Why am I not wearing it now? so I shall just do so. This is Lorenzo Villoresi Ambra. And as noted, Ambra in Italian is often referring to ambergris. Well, Ambra opens with this burst of ambergris alongside bitter galbanum. So you're getting this bitter green herbalness alongside a bright, breathy blast of salty ambergris. It's beautiful. But what actually happens as this dries down is it becomes, in the mid, more about incense kind of swirling around in the air. And finally, in the dry down, what happens is labdanum, that's a through line here, assembles alongside the vanilla and the musk almost in real time to form a very classic, slightly mid 20th century version of an amber accord. This is breathtaking perfumery done as well as it can, especially since it just evolves in slow motion over the space of 3 hours or so on skin. It's a real journey, a 3-act symphony, if you will. Beautiful, beautiful piece, beautiful fragrance, Villoresi Ambra. But another Italian fragrance that is doing this same sort of thing, but more heavily on the amber accord side, is AcquaFlor, house in Florence. Not discussed as much because their distribution is very narrow, but they have some beautiful fragrances, and Ambra is my favorite of theirs. Ambra is this it's an ambergris rose, but it's an ambergris amber rose. So as noted, the amber accord is created of vanilla, resins, musk, and by resins we really mean labdanum. Labdanum here is definitely the through line, blending with rose, but it's got this pungent saltiness that is evoking ambergris. I'm not sure ambergris is properly an element here, but it's evoking it through this heavy dose of saltiness. It's almost like a kind of doughy vanilla rose with a lot of salt in it. I get a lot of dough in this. Smoke too. There's like an incensey facet to this that is very interesting, that I like quite a bit. And so between this and Villoresi's Ambra, they kind of bridge the gap between what's an ambergris fragrance and what's a proper classic amber. And so when I think of like what is the most prototypical amber, if somebody's going to get to know an amber, there are a few of those in the market, but I don't think any in my collection is better or more representative of the amber accord as a genre, especially as a soliflor, than Rania J. Ombre Loup. Ombre Loup is such a bold, big, labdanum heavy amber. In the modern style, modern ambers are increasingly filled out with vanillic richness. And this has, especially in the opening, a sort of Christmassy spiced cake feeling to it that is very appropriate to the modern market. But the reason why I prefer this to something like Grand Soir or something like that is also a modern popular amber is the way that this still preserves the richness and dustiness of labdanum as a raw element. Labdanum is such a wonderfully intriguing and rich material unto itself. I've had arguments with people as to whether labdanum is unto itself an amber or whether it's just a component of an amber accord. I think it can stand alone because if you push labdanum into its own lane a bit, you end up with something like this fragrance, which is one of my all-time favorites, Serge Luton, La Couche du Diable. La Couche du Diable is labdanum with more resins and like scorched smoky woods and citrus, but the sort of vanilla that rounds out an amber accord isn't really here. And it creates an effect that is reminiscent of an amber, but is distinct from it. If you compare it to something like Ambre Loup, there's a world of difference between them, where Ambre Loup really gets into that fully round, complete amber accord in a way that you can then start picking this up and its variations in other fragrances. I really think this is a fair prototypical amber. The prototypical ambers as a category also have things in them like Ambre Narguile, I should say. Ambre Narguile. I want to say I in my mind I always say Narguile, but it's not that. But Ambre Narguile, which was a lovely fragrance for Hermès, and kind of brings the amber into the more modern gourmand direction with like apple pie spice vibes. A vague suggestion by way of tonka of tobacco. But you can see how the amber in modern terms increasingly skews gourmand with this, which this isn't even that modern. I mean, this was 2004, but it set the course for a lot of popular fragrances, and many popular hyped fragrances now really owe credit back to Ambre Narguile. Such as some of the Killian fragrances that are very popular. And you can smell the connection between this and Ambre Loup if you smell them side by side, in the way that this doesn't quite go to the gourmand facets as heavily as this one does, because it still focuses on the labdanum. This starts to skew more into the vanillic category. But it's still rich, it's powdery, it's round. In more classic constructions of ambers, this is not a classic fragrance, but it's a fragrance in a very classic style, is Prada Marienbad, which, if you haven't smelled this is a rarer fragrance to smell. Maybe something akin to halfway between, a Shalimar and a Chanel Le Lion, something in that category. But this has a sort of like fruity plum rose note into it that's almost sort of is retro, but is also a little bubblegummy almost in its own way, on top of a classic powdery amber accord that's a little bit more retro. This fragrance here too, Floris No. 007, which came out a few years ago, kind of exists in a similar space, just on a more masculine, quote unquote, style of fragrance, where it takes the sort of gentlemanly floral fragrance of the mid 20th century and builds it around a similarly very powdery classic amber. Both of these are powdery, soft fragrances, very quasi-retro, quasi-modern. Marienbad is, of the two, the more interesting, but they are both really well-rounded modern approaches on a retro amber. Finalizing my survey of ambers in my collection are going to be these next three here, and each in their own way feels more like what I think of as a very distinctly modern amber that doesn't skew in the gourmand direction. These are all fragrances from notable modern houses. So the first of these I've talked about before, Cartier Oud Ambre by Mathilde Laurent for that house. If you compare this to something like Ambre Loup, Ambre Loup is much sweeter and more vanillic. What this ends up doing is this really pushes an amber accord into a waxy balsamic space. So as noted, sometimes amber can go a little bit doughy in the way that the vanilla is playing with the labdanum and musk there. This one feels almost like you distilled an amber accord into like a scented wax nugget of some kind. It's very waxy, it's very balsamic. It has the powderiness lurking in there from that labdanum. Has a bit of smoke too, because labdanum can be a little smoky. But the vanilla is firmly in the background here. This is very resinous. I like it quite a bit. It's very similar to the wonderful amber accord in Tom Ford Tobacco Oud, which I like quite a bit. Now, I haven't smelled Tom Ford Tobacco Oud in its more recent incarnations. This is a very old bottle of Tom Ford Tobacco Oud. But the amber in this is similarly smoky and resinous. In fact, Tobacco Oud, more than anything, is an amber fragrance, despite what anybody says about it. There's tobacco on top of it. A wonderful, like, slightly chewy tobacco, and a bit of cistus smoke wrapped around that amber accord. So it's smoky, it's dark, it's bitter, but especially when it dries down, these two start to develop a real kinship to one another in the way that they approach amber as this sort of dry, smoky, balsamic experience. It's very modern without skewing gourmand. These are not sweet fragrances. I would say this is the Oud Ambre by Cartier is more approachable than Tobacco Oud. Tobacco Oud was notably pulled from the American market because I think it was a little bit challenging. But those all capture what I like about the way labdanum plays with amber without skewing too heavy on the vanilla. If you've noticed everything I've reviewed here, I don't think anything here is overly heavy on the vanilla. The closest you're getting to a full-on gourmand is the Hermès Ambre Narguile. But in general, I tend to stay away from the vanilla drowning out the rest of the amber. I really like being able to sink my teeth into the labdanum facets, those sort of leathery facets. And I'm going to end on a fragrance that really brings out the leathery facet of labdanum, and that is Dias and Durga Amber Kiso. Amber Kiso is it's quite a fragrance. It's not for the faint of heart, especially in warm to mostly temperate weather, because once it gets very cold, this actually wears a lot easier. But it is the fact that this is a very smoky fragrance. It's very much a leather fragrance. You could almost call it leather Kiso instead of amber Kiso. But that labdanum through line is there. It's just used as part of a leather accord and an amber accord at the same time. So you have the leather at the forefront, but you have the amber backing. And there's some nice facets here, like a sort of maple note, adding a little bit of the sweetness that you would ordinarily get from vanilla. This is an interesting counterpoint to something like the Ambre Loup. Because if you smell them side by side, they have a kinship, but one is like much easier, much to wear, much more approachable than Amber Kiso, which I think is going to scare away a lot of people. But I like to wear this one a lot. I like the hardiness of the leather. I love the way the maple syrupy sweetness comes out, especially in cooler weather, and sort of wraps that labdanum leather accord together. It's beautiful stuff. And fits in with my appetite for darker, smokier fragrances. That is generally what makes my heart sing in the fragrance world, is those dark, smoky things, which is why, you know, I'm so drawn to a fragrance like La Couche du Diable, which brings out those wonderful cola-style facets of labdanum alongside dark woods. But we've surveyed, fragrances here from amber resin to ambergris through a whole spectrum of styles of amber. It's with any video where I've talked about a lot of fragrances, it's always like, it's almost a bit too much. I would say if you're going to prioritize sampling an amber because you just want to understand the category, as an accord, it's Rania J Ambre Loup. If you're looking to understand ambergris as an effect, I really love Sheikh Al Faransi by Maison Anthony Marmin. If you're looking to understand amber resin, you won't do better than Clandestine Laboratories Silver. And if you're just looking to find a masterpiece of a fragrance, you won't do better than Villoresi Ambra, which is just a symphony unto itself. So on that note, I'll conclude this video. I've been yammering away for over 30 minutes. And I appreciate you staying with me, listening to me ramble on. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. What are your favorite ambergris fragrances? What are your favorite amber-focused fragrances, meaning amber the accord? And are there any amber resin fragrances you've tried that might not be on my radar? That's kind of a rare subcategory. It's not very common, but they do exist, and I haven't tried that many. So I would love to hear from you about those. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.